They said Pascagoula never truly went dark, not even under wartime blackout. The shipyards glowed like low embers behind the papered windows, and the river carried a runnel of light where welders stitched steel into hulls for a war an ocean away. In 1942, the town smelled of pine resin, salt, and hot metal. The bus from Mobile brought new faces at all hours: riveters, machinists, soldiers on pass with cap bills pulled low. Air raid wardens walked the streets with flashlights hooded like cat's eyes. In church basements, women rolled bandages and learned to aim at silhouettes on paper, just in case. People double-checked their locks, not because of spies, though everyone talked about spies, but because a lot of strangers were sleeping in rooms that used to be empty. The first report was almost funny in a small-town way. A girl woke to find a window screen pried loose and a cool draft on her neck. She reached for the switch, didn't find it, blackout, and called her mother. When the flashlight finally licked the room, the girl's braid lay on the pillow, shortened by several inches. The jagged cut looked like a practical joke played by someone who didn't know how to keep his hand steady. Nothing else was missing. Money remained where it had been shoved under a sweater. A drawer hung open but still full. The only theft, it seemed, was hair. The next day, the paper ran the tale between blackout tips and bond drive totals, and the town practiced a laugh that didn't quite fit in its mouth. Then another house, then two in 1 week. In one of them, a young mother woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. The nursery window stood open to the coastal damp, and the baby's curls had been snipped, each lock lifted as neatly as a florist reaches for ribbon. In another, twins whispered they'd seen a shadow at the foot of their bed, and everyone told them it was just the shared dream of children who needed less radio and more sleep. But the locks kept shortening. A teenager found a clump of hair on the porch steps like a calling card. A woman who had promised herself she would never be silly about such things set a chair under her doorknob and braced it with an iron skillet. Pascagoula learned a new choreography. Men patrolled their own streets after a late shift, keeping time with the river. Dogs that had always barked at possums now earned steak for barking at nothing. Screen windows grew patched with wire and then with boards. Storekeepers laid out handbells beside the register and sold out in an afternoon. When the coastal wind shifted, you could hear the ship horns, and, beneath them, the tight wire of everyone's nerves humming in chorus. The paper, which had promised not to sensationalize, learned how to write rumors in a responsible tone. It printed more blackout rules and advised mothers to move cribs away from windows. The city council talked about curfews and then decided the war had already given them as many rules as people could stand. The name appeared as if it had always been waiting for its own headline, the Phantom Barber. It worked because it was neat and because the town needed a way to keep from saying, "Someone is walking through our houses while we sleep." Everyone decided it was a he, though no one had seen a face, slipped through screens like a draft. He carried scissors or a razor and left his hand where the light couldn't find it. He didn't take jewelry or ration books or cash. He trimmed what people trusted to their pillows. The barber's art blasphemed, a private act made public by a stranger's nerve. Some nights, the stories rang with details that felt true. A sawhorse at the edge of a yard moved an inch in the yard's small topography. A twig snapped under a window, and a neighbor discovered footprints pointed toward the Shell Road and then nowhere at all. Other nights, the town's imagination worked overtime. The Phantom Barber took on the shape of a sailor resentful at being turned away from a porch, or of a jealous shopgirl who had been passed over by the man in the next block. He was a German agent, a carnival hand, a woman in a man's coat, a man in a woman's perfume. He was what fear makes out of fog. Then came a line the story had not yet crossed. A couple, a mill worker and his wife, woke when a shape rose beside the bed like a detached piece of darkness. The man moved to sit up. Something, a club, the flat side of a hatchet, found his skull with the blunt authority of woodworking tools. He half heard his wife's cry, saw a fringe of his own hair on the quilt, and slipped under. They lived, but blood changed the temperature of the tale. The Phantom Barber was no longer just an intimate thief. He was, might be, willing to break bone to protect his exit. The sheriff added men. The shipyard sent volunteers who had learned to carry a riveter in one hand and a worry in the other. Search parties walked alleys with hooded lamps. At the railway cut, 2 boys found a nest where someone had slept under palmetto fronds, newspaper for a pillow, 2 beer bottles, and a strip of cloth that smelled of barbershop tonic. The sheriff kept the cloth and told the papers he would know the scent anywhere. The crowds at church prayed both for war news that would end and for haircuts that would go back to being a domestic affair between people whose names you knew. Arrests came, as arrests do when a town wants an ending. A man with a grudge against the mill's management, a small-time burglar who preferred empty kitchens to occupied bedrooms, a veteran whose temper had frayed where his nerves broke. Each candidate explained some corner of the rumor, but not all of it. There were affidavits that matched what people needed to hear, and affidavits that unraveled on the first tug. The paper printed a name that half the town accepted with relief and half rejected with the kind of suspicion that keeps a porch light on long after the next day's sun has proved how needless that was. A judge did what judges do, measured evidence against rules, declared a result, and left the rest to memory. Even as headlines tried to close the file, the tale continued in smaller rooms. A barber placed his shears on a velvet square in the shop window every night, like a public promise to keep blades where they belonged. Girls tucked ribbons into knit caps for sleep. Summer heat be damned. A woman turned the mirror from the bed so that, if she woke suddenly, the glass wouldn't give the room back to her with a stranger in it. The war moved the seasons. Men shipped out, new men arrived. German submarines sank ships off the Gulf and gave the town something larger to fear again. But the Phantom Barber did not vanish. He turned into the thing adults told one another at picnics when the wind from the river lifted the tablecloth. He became a conditional clause in a mother's sentence. Lock the window, you remember why. What do we do with a legend that touches a fact and then keeps walking? Some of the victims were sure of their memories, the tug at their scalp, the draft on the back of the neck, the embarrassed laughter that crumpled when it met light. Others admitted that fear takes a shape in the dark and then insists you respect its outline. A blackout town in wartime can breed shapes. But in Pascagoula, traces remained. Torn screens, clippings, cuts jagged enough to make a hairdresser sigh, a club left beneath a hedge that did not belong to any tool rack in that house. The lesson the town learned was a plain one, which is why it is so hard to hold without dropping. Danger is not always the great melodrama you train for while air raid sirens wail. Sometimes it wears soft soles and moves like a draft, leaving nothing behind that can be weighed on a scale. It bruises trust rather than bone, and leaves a house clean except for the place where your hand goes absent-mindedly to check what used to be there. The Phantom Barber hurt pride and privacy, which sounds small until you live with the version of yourself that knows even your sleep is not entirely your own. Years later, Pascagoula raised new buildings and retired old shadows. The shipyard's wartime roar softened to a peacetime hum. The streets got brighter. Children grew up hearing 2 categories of story: the war everyone acknowledged, and the war the town had with itself when the lights were low. Sit with the fisherman under the bridge, and one of them will offer both in the same paragraph. He'll point with his chin toward houses that used to be wood and are now brick and say, "We had a fella come through here who cut hair while you slept," as if naming a kind of weather. He'll laugh because people prefer to laugh at what they cannot fix. Then he'll add, almost kindly, that in the end folks learned to close their windows, not because they hated the breeze, but because a story had taught them to. Maybe the Phantom Barber was a single prowler who found a pocket of time when war bent routines and fear did his camouflage for him. Maybe he was several men, a town folded into one name, so it could tell the tale simpler and sleep easier later. In either case, the lesson had the blunt authority of a hatchet's flat side. Security is as much a habit as a lock. In 1942, Pascagoula made new habits and kept its sleeplessness company until it could let it go. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.